The Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Cure. Can one blind person lead another? Won't they both fall into the ditch? The student is not superior to the teacher, but if the students are well taught, they will become like their teacher. Why do you notice the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and not the wooden plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, "Let me take the sawdust out from your eye," when you cannot see the plank in your own? Hypocrite! Remove the plank from your own eye first, then you will see clearly enough to remove the sawdust from your brother's eye. No good tree produces rotten fruit, and no bad tree produces good fruit. Each tree is known by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes, nor gather grapes from blackberry brambles. Good people draw what is good from the treasure of their own hearts. Bad people produce what is bad from the evil within them. A person's words flow from what is treasured in their heart. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and then not do what I say? I will show you what the person who comes to me, hears what I have to say, and acts accordingly is really like. That person is like someone building a house who digs deeply and lays the foundations on bedrock. The rains pour down, the floods rise in a torrent, and the winds blow and bear upon that house, but it does not fall, because it is built on rock. But the one who listens and does nothing is like the person who builds a house in sand with no foundation. When the river bursts against it, it collapses immediately and is destroyed. A word inspired by God. My grandfather, Daddy Jim, was born in 1882, a stone's throw from Blarney Castle, where the famous Blarney Stone is. Some of you may have gone and kissed it. And at the age of about 16, he began to serve his time as an apprentice to become what's called a plater. So he spent 6 years training to be a plater. Platers were the people in Ireland at that stage who fashioned the agricultural instruments, spades and shovels and forks and shlons. The shlons were the implements that were used for digging turf or peat, as you guys call it here. So he served his time for 6 years, and then he was a fully trained plater. And when I got to know him, which was 1946, he worked in a shovel mills about 8 miles outside of Cork City, a place called Menard Mills. And he worked inside in a tiny little hovel with a huge big roaring furnace and a big mechanical hammer and an anvil. And he'd be taking the steel and fashioning it into various forms. So he's filled with grime and dirt, obviously, at the end of the day. But at the end of every week, my grandmother would prepare a bath for him. And the bath literally was just a tin tub that would be inside in the kitchen. And she'd be pouring hot water into it during the afternoon. And by the time he got home on Friday evening, he'd have his bath. And he'd scour himself and scrub himself like a shiny new penny. And then she'd feed him. And he'd get his wages every Friday. And at that stage, nobody in Ireland had a bank account. They'd never seen a checkbook in their lives. So everybody was paid. They got a little package with money in it, cash. A few coins and some paper money as well. And he'd give that to my grandmother. And then he'd have his dinner. And then she'd give him, every Friday evening, she'd give him a half a crown. And half a crown, I don't know what it'd be worth in modern day American money, maybe like $4 or $5. And he'd dress up in his Sunday best. And he'd always wear a buttonhole. He'd pick a flower of the garden, put it in his buttonhole, and he'd pick up his favourite walking stick. He used to make his own walking sticks from blackthorn trees. And he'd have his walking stick, and he'd stride off whistling. He was a great whistler, a great musician as well. And he'd head off to the pub, and the pub was about 3 miles away. And at some stage of the journey, 2 roads would coalesce. He was coming from Menard, and his best buddy, Tom Donovan, was coming from a place called Killeens. And the 2 roads would merge, and then they'd go off for another 1.5 miles down to the pub. And they'd solve all the world's problems on the journey. And they'd go to the pub, and they'd nurse 2 pints each of Murphy's Stout. Nobody in Cork drank Guinness. Guinness is a foreign drink which is brewed up in Dublin. So they drank Murphy's, which was the local brew. Now, they'd have to nurse it because that's all they could afford was 2 drinks. And at the end of the evening, we have a phrase in Gaelic that says, ÓLaoire. And ÓLaoire, the best translation would be like, they had a buzz on. Now, no self-respecting Irishman could get drunk on 2 pints of beer. So they wouldn't be drunk, but they would have a nice buzz on, and they'd be solving all the world's problems. And then at 11:30, they'd get kicked out of the pub, and they'd start walking home. And they continued to solve the world's problems. And then they came to this bifurcation point, and Tom would have to go way up to the left, about 1.5 miles, and my grandfather would have to go to the right, 1.5 miles. And so they'd come to that place, and they were going to say goodnight, and then one of them would say, I can't let you go home on your own in the dark. You could fall into a ditch or anything. I'm going to take you to your door. And he'd persuade him, and one of them would take the other guy to his door, and he'd say goodnight to him, and he'd go off to leave, and the other guy would say, no, I wouldn't have it on my conscience. If you had an accident on the way home and your wife blamed me, I'd never forgive me. I said, no, Jim, I'm going home with you. And they'd walk back to my grandfather's house, and then they get to the front door, and Tom would say goodnight, and my grandfather would say, I can't leave you like this. It's a real dark night. Anything could happen to you. And they'd go back up to Tom's house again. So they'd be up and down the road for the next 3 or 4 hours. Until finally, one of the wives would wake up and open the door and grab her man and say, come in out of that, you bloody idiot, and stop making a fool of yourself in front of the neighbours. And she'd drag him in, and then the other poor guy would have to go off on his own. So every time I hear this parable of Jesus Christ, or this saying of Jesus Christ, the blind leading the blind, I think of my grandfather, and I think of Tom Donovan. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm just going to make 3 main points this morning. I'm going to talk about blindness, and then I'm going to talk about projection, and then I'm going to talk about house building, because these are the 3 little parables that Jesus tells in this morning's gospel. So first, the notion of blindness. Jesus goes back to this theme very, very frequently in his teachings. And obviously, the blindness he has in mind is not so much physical impairment as much as it is kind of mental or spiritual impairment. So he tells lots of parables, and there are lots of incidents in his life around the issue of blindness. One of my favorites is, you'll find it in John's Gospel in chapter 9, where Jesus is coming out of the city of Jericho with his disciples, and as they're coming out, they see a blind man sitting at the gates. And this man was born blind, and he's well known. Everybody knows this blind man, Bartimaeus. He sits and he begs every day. And the disciples ask him a question. They say, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sin, or because of the sin of his parents? So Jesus says, neither because of his parents' sin nor his own sin, but that the glory of God might be manifested in him. And then he called over the man, and he healed him. And the man is obviously delighted, this poor Angashore who's born blind and has been begging all his life. So he's prancing around with pure furaha, pure joy. And it's brought to the attention of the Pharisees, and they're really, really upset. So they grab the guy and they begin to interrogate him. And they say, were you really born blind? And he says, absolutely. How come you can see now? Well, this man called Jesus, he put spittle, he spat in his fingers, and he rubbed it in my eyes, and all of a sudden I can see. Isn't it great? They wouldn't believe that he was born blind. So they find his parents, and they drag the parents in, and they say, is this your son? And they say, yeah, that's our son. Was he born blind? Yeah, he was born blind. So how come he can see now? We don't know. He's an adult. Ask himself. So they drag the man back for a second interrogation, and they say, give glory to God. What happened? He said, I'll tell you what happened. I told you already. I was born blind. I've been blind all my life, and this character, Jesus, came along, and he cured me, and now I can see. Do you want to become his disciples as well? And they said, God forbid. You were born in sin. We know that this man is not from God. And the guy says, really? It's never been heard since the beginning of the world that anybody could give sight to the blind, and this man just did it, and you say he's not from God? So they kick him out. How dare you preach to us, you creature that was born in sin? So now they start interrogating Jesus. And they say, big argument with Jesus. And finally, at the end of it, they get the impression that he's telling them they're blind. So they say to him, are you telling us that we're blind? And Jesus says, if you knew you were blind, I could cure you. But since you believe you're not blind, I can't do anything with you. So that's one great story about blindness. There's another great story in the Gnostic Gospel of Philip, where the other disciples of Jesus are really upset that he seems to favor Mary of Magdala. And they say to him, why do you love her more than you love us? Because you constantly kiss her. And Christ gives a very enigmatic response. He says, once upon a time, there were 2 men in a dark, 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 dark cave. One of them was a blind man, and the other was a sighted man, but neither of them could see because they were both in this dark cave. But they came out of the cave into the sunlight, and now the blind man is still blind and can't see, but the sighted man now can see in the presence of the light. That's why I love Mary more than I love you. So what's the meaning of this? Obviously that the blindness is such that, even in the presence of the light, they can't really see who Jesus is. Mary of Magdala gets it completely. She totally gets who this guy is. But none of the others can really see who Jesus is. They think that he's a meal ticket to fame. He's going to be the Messiah, and they're going to be the Minister for Education, and the Minister for Defense, and the Minister for Medicine. That's all they can see. Job opportunities. Mary can see who he really is. So he's talking again about this notion of blindness. So blindness has to do with our ability to see the truth. It's not just about physical impairment, our ability to see the truth. Now the problem is, I'm totally convinced that there is no such thing as an a priori truth. There is no such thing, there is no proposition which is inexorably and incontrovertibly self-evident truth. If there were, then everybody on the planet would be able to say, oh yeah, that's true. There's no proposition you can offer that everybody on the planet will say, yeah, that's true. And so Thomas Aquinas said very famously in the 1200s, truth is found only in the judgment. So when you're faced with a proposition of any kind, you do a judgment about it. Sometimes it's very unconsciously done. It's almost like a reflexive action. But every single one of us is going to make a judgment about this proposition and decide for ourselves whether or not it is true. But there is no such thing as an a priori truth. A self-evidently, obvious, incontrovertibly true statement. Otherwise, every single person on the planet would get behind it and say, yes, I agree that that is the case. So if truth is found only in the judgment, how do we go about making that judgment? And there are three basic ways in which we do it. The first one is we rely upon some authority figure. The priest told me, or the politician said it, or the scientist wrote about it, or I saw it in a newscast. Some talking head said this was true, or I read it in the newspaper, or the Pope declared it in Rome. And so one is authority. Some authority figure said it, and therefore I believe it to be true. But that's an act of faith. I haven't looked at the data for myself. I haven't really made a judgment. I have an unconscious response to a statement by an authority figure, and I believe it's true because they told me that it was true. That's the first way we find truth. The second way is we experience something for ourselves, even if it is totally contradictory to the given viewpoint. An atheist who has a near-death experience and who's lived all his life in the belief system that there is no such thing as God, and then they have a near-death experience, that is, without a shadow of a doubt, their own experience trumps everything else they believed before that, or anybody else chooses to believe, because they've experienced what it's like to be on the other side. So a personal experience really trumps the authority figures. And the third way is to figure stuff out for yourself. That is, you assemble all the data pieces you can assemble, and you try to put the jigsaw puzzle together in a way that makes sense to you. And that's how you arrive. So we arrive at it in one of three ways, or in a combination of them. Now, none of these methods is infallible, in spite of what Pius IX would have us believe in Vatican I in 1871. There are no infallible truths. None of these methods is infallible. But if you cross-fertilize the three of them, it's more likely than not that you'll arrive at some kind of truth. But there is I believe, no a priori truth. There's a judgment involved on the part of every single one of us faced with any particular proposition. Now, I'm totally convinced, for instance, that atheism, militant atheism, and kind of a materialistic science are as much caricatures of truth-seeking as is fundamentalist religion. Militant atheism is a religion. It's as much a religion as Southern American Baptist is, because you have to make an act of faith in a bunch of propositions that you can't possibly prove. It is actually, in my opinion, it is much more difficult to prove that God does not exist than it is to prove that God does exist. Now, you can't do either. You can't prove that God exists to the satisfaction of somebody who's not going to believe it. And you can't prove that God does not exist to somebody who's had a personal experience of the divine. But on the face of it, it is actually much more difficult to adduce data that supports the view that God does not exist than supports the view that God does exist. Because, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It only takes one white crow to give the lie to the proposition that all crows are black. And it doesn't mean that if you still haven't found the white crow, that all crows are black. You find even a single one and it undoes your whole argument. So I think it's much more difficult to try to prove, you can't do it, that God does not exist, than to prove, which you also can't do, that God does exist. But the preponderance of the evidence moves towards the existence of some kind of extraordinary divinity. Now, in the middle of all that, searching and pain, there must be some kind of orienting principles that allow us to guide the ship of our life through this morass of competing propositions. So what they look like. I think that a truth system, any belief system or any set of propositions that moves an individual or a culture or a society into love or justice or compassion or forgiveness is much more likely to be true than a set of propositions that move us inexorably towards war or conflict or greed or prejudice. So on the basis of the fruit that Jesus is talking about today, on the basis of the tree, you know a tree by its fruit, it is much more likely that one set of propositions is true than that the other one. So if the best explanation of the data leads us into war, it's not the best explanation of the data. If the best explanation of the data is that it allows us to ravage our planet ecologically, that is not the best explanation of the data. There must be a different model, a better model. And the truth of it is found by the fruits. So that's the first point I would make. This kind of this blindness, inability to see what the truth might be. The second thing Jesus picks up on this morning is the notion of projection. And I love this particular translation of it this morning. This is from the Gospel of Q. And Q, as you remember, doesn't actually exist. It's an inferred document. When the great German scholars in the 1850s were trying to make sense of the four canonical Gospels and how much overlap there is, they could see very, very clearly that there were huge chunks of material that they found in Matthew's Gospel and they found in Luke's Gospel, which had been borrowed from Mark's Gospel, word for word. And so they attributed that to Mark. But then there was a whole bunch of material they found in Matthew's Gospel and they found in Luke's Gospel, word for word, that wasn't in Mark. So they reckoned it must have come from some other source that's now been lost. So they called it Q, or from the German word Quelle, meaning the source. So there must have been some document from which these two borrowed, but the document itself has been lost, it's never been recovered. And that was the gospel read this morning. And that version says, Jesus talking about projection, and he says, why do you see the sawdust in your brother's eye and not see the plank in your own? Now, the other verses, Matthew's version and Mark's version and Luke's version say, why do you see the splinter in your brother's eye and not see the plank in your own? So there is between sawdust and a splinter. Now, if you've ever done any carpentry, you know that it's fairly unusual to get a splinter in your eye. It happens, but it's very unusual. But it's quite common to get sawdust in your eye. So anybody coming from a carpentry background or who's done even as a weekend carpenter knows that unless you wear goggles of some kind, it's very likely you're going to get sawdust in your eye, whether you're using a handsaw or a table saw or whatever. So this would have been much more likely that people would have had that experience of getting sawdust in their eyes. So when Jesus uses the proverb this morning, why can you see the sawdust in your brother's eye and you can't see the plank in your own? First take the plank out of your own eye and then you'll see more clearly. If you've ever had the experience of working with somebody at a table saw and stuff gets into his eye and you say, can you get that out? It's really, really irritating. And you take a corner of a handkerchief and you open up his eye and you're trying to poke out the sawdust. Now, if you have sawdust in your own eye, there's no way you can take the sawdust out of the other guy's eye. But if you've got a plank in your eye, you certainly can't be taking sawdust out of somebody else. You'll gouge his eye out if you attempt to clear it out. So this is what Jesus has in mind. And his audience would have understood it. So what is the notion then, this notion of projection? So I've told you this story a few times, but it's really pertinent, so I'm going to go back on it again. As a small child growing up in Cork City, every Saturday morning there was a movie theatre in Cork City called the Lido. And it was a big barn of a building with just wooden benches and a big whitewashed front wall acting as the screen. And they would put on matinee performances for little children on Saturday mornings. It was typically Tarzan or a cowboy movie. And the price of admission was 2 milk bottles. You'd wash the milk bottles, bring them down, and that's what you paid to get in. But all of the little boys would fill their pockets with stones. And we'd come in, and we're sitting watching the movie, and at some stage, the baddie was going to climb up behind the good guy, and the good guy wasn't aware of it. And we'd be shouting instructions, look out behind you! Look out! The baddie is coming up behind you! And of course, the good guy would ignore us. So we'd have to intervene and try to save his life. So we'd take out the stones, and we'd start pelting the screen. at the baddie. And after 2 or 3 minutes, the house lights would come on, and the movie would go, grind to a halt, and some big buxom guy would come in, and he'd drag 2 or 3 kids at random out and just fire their asses out of the theatre. And then the movie would start up again, and within 10 minutes, we'd have the Stones out pelting the screen. Because somehow we felt that we could intervene meaningfully in the narrative, that we could make a change to the outcome by throwing stones at it. Now, Carl Jung famously then talked about this notion of projection, but Jesus had beaten to it by 2,000 years. So we think that the action is actually happening up in the screen, where in fact it's happening up in the projectionist box. But if you were to watch a movie, on a roll of celluloid, 1 inch by 1 inch frames, it would be really, 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 really boring. And you couldn't actually see the difference from frame to frame. You'd have no sense of change or motion. But now you project it onto a huge big screen. Instead of 1 inch by 1 inch, you've got 40 foot by 30 foot, and there's action happening because you're shining light through it. But it's not actually happening up there, and you're wasting your time throwing stones at the screen if you think you're going to affect the outcome. So the same thing is true, that projection is the first part of a 2-part mechanism, psychologically speaking. The first part, you project outside of you so that you can see clearly what's inside. Because inside, it's in tiny little frames. But when you project it onto somebody else, you see it clearly, a full human figure acting out. Now you project it in order to see what's in here. The second part should be, you now introject it. Okay, I've seen what's inside here now clearly, now I have to deal with it in here. But most of us never get to the second part. We think it's actually happening out there, so we start throwing stones at the other person who is merely the screen on which we projected our own shadow material. So that's what Jesus is talking about this morning. And we do this not just as individuals, we do it as communities, we do it as nations, we do it as a global community. So when I do this as an individual, 1 or 2 things is going to happen. Carl Jung actually said that the shadow is 80% gold. It is 80% unrealized potential. So when I project that part of myself onto somebody else, I make a hero or a heroine of them. And instead of developing those characteristics in myself, I just admire them and become what they call it, a groupie of that person, instead of developing myself. And that means that it's a wasted projection. The projection should encourage me to develop the same skill set. But the other 20% is dark stuff, repressed traumata, hidden, darkness in myself. When I project that onto somebody else, I have to make them the villain. And if I do that on an individual basis, then it leads to interpersonal animosity between us. And that happens all the time in many, many relationships. But we do this as communities. Entire communities project their unresolved own darkness as a community onto another community. And then typically we'll call them names. They're the commies, or they're the queers, or they're the niggers, or they're the papists. We'll always come up with some derogatory term to kind of categorize the other people. And now we're dumping all of our undealt with material as a community onto another community. When we do this as a nation, we spend literally billions of dollars of propaganda trying to convince ourselves that we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, and then we spend billions more dollars going to war and killing them. Every single war on planet Earth is the result of a projection where we made some group the bad guys and us the good guys, and then went out and started killing them. And we do this even as a species. The entire species, Homo sapiens sapiens, is taking its unresolved own darkness as a species and dumping it on nature very, very often. I spoke a few months ago about this great, what's called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. There's an area in the Pacific between the United States, and North America at least, and Asia, where because of the tidal formations, the kind of gyroscopic tidal formation, all of the gunk that's dumped off the west coast of North America and the east coast of Asia is spiraling into an area which is actually bigger than the state of Texas right now. Dumped garbage, particularly plastics. And it's getting into the food chain, because microorganisms are feeding on it, and the fish are feeding on the microorganisms, and the bigger fish are feeding them, and they're winding up inside in our Safeways and our good food markets. Lovely fish, we think great fish, and we're actually eating the plastic that we have dumped ourselves. So it always comes back and it bites us. And so we're dumping this stuff even as a human species. So this is what Jesus has in mind this morning. He's not just talking about interpersonal conflict. He's talking about intercommunal affairs. He's talking about national affairs and global affairs, that we need to take back this material if there is ever to be peace in our world. This brings me to the third part then this morning. He uses this phrase of house building. So house building in some senses, obviously it not just means physical dwelling. He's talking about the place where your consciousness or your sense of self or your model of life dwells. So when he talks about building a house on firm ground, he's building what I would call a personal cosmology, a view of the world that tells you how to orient yourself in the world and how to respond to different situations. Now, every single one of us has an inbuilt personal cosmology. Every single one of us has. But we've acquired this unconsciously. We got it as small little children from our parents, and then we got it from our teachers, then we got it from the churches, then we got it from the news media, then we got it from our politicians, and we've put together this model of how life is meant to be lived. But it has been unconsciously acquired. And when you put us in any situation, it will be unconsciously accessed. So if I say to you, Bernadette, why do you think you said that in that particular situation? Bernadette will likely say, well, it seemed like the right thing to say. I say to George, why did you act that way rather than in a different fashion? And George will say, well, it felt like it was the right thing to do. Now, where did that right thing to say or that right thing to do come out of? It came out of an internalized model of how life is meant to be lived, but you've unconsciously acquired it, and now you've unconsciously accessed it in a particular response to a situation. This is precisely what the great teachers constantly invade against. The Lao Tzus of the world, or the Buddhas of the world, or the Socrates of the world, or the Jesus Christ of the world. The unexamined life is not worth living. If I'm living my life driven by an unconsciously acquired and an unconsciously accessed set of belief systems, I have no control over my destiny. And so bringing to full consciousness that which drives my behavior is so very, very important. And this again is what Jesus Christ will say again and again and again. So the blind person is the person who's not prepared to do the work of bringing to full consciousness the model which actually drives their behavior, and then figuring out what's helping here and what's not helping here. Often I'll give an exercise to my clients in my office to try to uncover some of this. And I'll say to them, I want you to go home and spend an hour and write down the 10 commandments by which you actually live. And I don't mean your ideals, how you'd be behaving if you were behaving optimally. And I don't mean the 10 commandments of Moses, and I don't mean the injunctions of the church. I mean, what are the 10 actual rules that drive your behavior? And what you find out very often is when you make a list of the 10 values that are actually driving your behavior, you find out that probably up to half of them are actually crucifying you. They're not liberating you from life, they're crippling you, and they're crucifying you. Specifically because you learn them from people who never examine them, because they get them from other people who never examine them, and so you wind up with a system that doesn't work anymore. But because it's unconsciously acquired and unconsciously accessed, you have no idea that it's crippling you. And this is what it means to be enlightened, or to come awake, or to examine your life. All the great teachers will point this out, that this is our job, to try to figure out. Now, we have to realize that we were not plopped onto this planet as perfect beings. Nobody comes in here as a perfected life form. In fact, on this little planet of ours, it's taken 3.7 billion years for life to evolve to the stage where Homo sapiens emerged. 3.7 billion years. For 1.5 billion years, there were only single-celled amoeba on the planet. And then some stage, it became multicellular organisms. And then the first great fish emerged. And then the amphibians who could live on land and sea. And then the reptiles emerged. It took billions of years for emotions to evolve. The mammals were the first creatures that had emotions, that could dream at night, raise their young, and have actual emotions. It took over 2 billion years for that process to emerge. With the advent of what's called the limbic brain, the mammalian part of the brain. It took us another 200 million years to develop the neocortex, which would allow us to intellectually manipulate symbols and develop language. But that's only half of the journey. We think that Homo sapiens sapiens is the end of the line, that it can't get any better, that we're the most intelligent life form in the universe. This is laughable. There are more stars in the heavens than there are grains of sand and all of the beaches on planet Earth. And we think that there's only life here, or that we're as good as it gets. If we're as good as it gets, God is a very, very poor creator. And so we have to realize there are other stages ahead of us as a human species. We've gone from biology, which is just the study of cellular life, to theology, to psychology, which is the study of emotions and cognition. And now we're in the stage of theology. We're talking about the soul. There's another stage after that, which is mysticism, which is the study of the spirit. And that's where we're headed for, because that's where we've come from. We have to complete the cycle. And so we can't achieve that until we come fully awake, until we learn to overcome the vicissitudes and the limitations of identifying ourselves with our physicality, our emotions, or even our intellectual abilities. We're not going to progress very much further as individuals and as communities and as a global species. So this, I believe, is what Jesus Christ has in mind when he says, building your house on rock, not on sand. When you build your house on sand, your self-image thinks that you are your body, or your self-image thinks that you are your emotions, or your self-image thinks that you are your intellect, and you're not any of those things. These were just gifts you received as part of the incarnational package. The real rock on which your incarnation has to be built is that you are an eternal being. You're a bite-sized piece of God having a human experience, that you're a spirit in a spacesuit, that you're a soul on safari on planet Earth. And if not built on that foundation, the house ain't going to go nowhere. You're not going to be able to put a second or a third story on such a house. Because the future, the unexamined future also, if the unexamined past is not worth living, the unexamined future is really, really scary. Because here's what the future is going to look like, technologically. There'll be 4 forms of evolution that will proceed from where we're at right now. And the first form of evolution is just the natural, evolution of which we've been part for 3.7 billion years. We're going to live a little bit longer. We're going to be a little bit more intelligent than previous generations are. That's kind of inevitable, but it's a glacial pace. There'll be a second form of evolution, which will be technologically or surgically enhanced, human beings, where through prosthesis of various kinds or injections of various kinds, we'll be able to improve our eyesight, our hearing capacities, our cognitive abilities. We'll be able to remember stuff, so we'll enhance our sensorium, our intellectual abilities, our longevity. That'll be a second course. There'll be a third line, which is the effort to download human consciousness into robots and make clones of them. So that if one version of me gets killed in a car accident, the information has been downloaded, so I just pick up the next version of my clone and I live forever. That's a third version of what possibly is ahead. And the fourth version is artificial intelligence itself. Robots who are brighter and more intelligent than human beings, who will invent other robots brighter than themselves, until finally the human species itself will be in an evolutionary cul-de-sac because they're useless. They have nothing to offer the planet anymore, and the future will consist of robotic creatures who are far more intelligent. There are the possibilities. Are we going to allow this to happen unchallenged? Are we going to take part in it? How are we going to address those kinds of possibilities if we don't know who we are to begin with? And who we are to begin with is, no matter what form, what material form consciousness will inhabit, the soul is eternal. The spacesuit, whether it lasts for 1,000 years or merely 60 years, is only a vehicle for a soul to experience incarnation. And whether a soul decides to experience incarnation as a puppy, or a kitty cat, or an oak tree, or a human being, or a robot, in some senses, it doesn't matter. If the soul is having experiences that are allowing it the possibility of moving towards unconditional love, then the vehicle doesn't matter that much. But if the soul is asleep and the vehicle is everything, we got problems.